At a party on Shelter Island, a billionaire hedge fund manager was showing off the house that his fortune had built, and the writer Kurt Vonnegut leaned over to his friend, the novelist Joseph Heller, and said something quietly cruel. "Joe," he said, "our host made more money in a single day than you ever earned from Catch-22 in the entire history of the book." Heller thought about it. Then he answered with 7 words that a man who would go on to build a company worth trillions would spend the rest of his life turning over. "Yes, but I have something he will never have. Enough." That man was John Bogle, the founder of Vanguard and the inventor of the index fund. And he built this whole book around a single, deeply unfashionable question. In a world engineered to make you want more, how would you ever know when you had enough? Here is why that question haunted Bogle. He had spent 57 years inside American finance, and he had watched the failure to ask it quietly poison 3 different things. It poisons our money because we let costs and speculation eat returns we never even notice leaving. It poisons our business because we start counting whatever is easy to measure and stop trusting what actually matters. And it poisons our lives because we chase what he called false rabbits, long after the chase has stopped meaning anything at all. Money, business, life, 3 arenas, 1 disease, never being able to say the word enough. But Bogle did not arrive at this as a philosopher looking down from above. He arrived at it as a man who had been broke, been fired, and been given a second heart. To understand his answer, you have to start where he started. John Bogle was born in 1929, a few months before the stock market took his family's money with it. His people were Scottish to the bone, raised on the idea that thrift was not a hardship but a virtue, that idle hands were the tools of the devil. His own great-grandfather had been an insurance crusader who stood in front of the industry's giants and told them, plainly, "Gentlemen, cut your costs." Then the crash came, and modest comfort turned into genuine struggle almost overnight. The Bogle boys grew up waiting tables and delivering newspapers, learning that money was something you earned an hour at a time and never, ever wasted. It would have been easy for a childhood like that to teach a boy to grab everything he could. Instead, strangely, it taught him the opposite. A life, he decided, did not need very much at all to be rich. A scholarship carried him to Blair Academy, where he waited tables to pay whatever the scholarship did not. And there he found a story that would shape everything. A famous old sermon called Acres of Diamonds. It tells of a farmer who hears of a fortune to be made in diamonds, sells his farm, and spends his whole life wandering the world in search of the mine. He dies far from home, having found nothing. And back on the land he sold, the new owner discovers that the ground itself is studded with diamonds. The treasure had been under his feet the entire time. Bogle took that parable personally. The chase, he decided, was the trap. Whatever was truly worth having was far more likely to be found in the work right in front of you than in some glittering elsewhere. But first, he had to find his own backyard. He found it in a magazine. As a Princeton student hunting for a thesis topic, Bogle opened a 1949 issue of Fortune and read about a tiny, contentious little industry almost nobody had heard of, mutual funds. He wrote his thesis arguing they should be run honestly and cheaply for the ordinary people who actually owned them. That thesis got him hired, and for 2 decades he climbed until he reached the very top of a firm called Wellington. And then, in the wreckage of the 1974 bear market, he was fired from the company he had given his life to. Most people would have called that the end. For Bogle, it turned out to be the strangest kind of beginning. Because buried in the fine print of how mutual funds were governed, he had spotted a loophole, and he was about to turn his own humiliation into something that had never existed before. What he built was a company that, by design, could never make him rich. Every other fund company was owned by outside investors who skimmed a profit off the top. Bogle's new firm, Vanguard, would instead be owned by the funds themselves, which meant it would be owned by the ordinary people who invested in them. There was no outside owner left to enrich. Every dollar saved on costs went straight back to the customer. Then, in 1975, he did the thing everyone laughed at. Rather than paying star stock pickers to try to beat the market, he built a fund that simply bought the entire market and held it at almost no cost. They called it Bogle's Folly. Today, that single idea manages trillions of dollars. He had turned being fired into a machine for giving money away, and he had done it on purpose. But why would any sane person do that? The answer runs back, of all places, to Socrates. Bogle loved a moment when the old philosopher confronts the citizens of Athens and asks how they can pour themselves into money and reputation and honor while caring so little for wisdom, for truth, and for the improvement of their own souls. Are you not ashamed of this? For Bogle, that question never once stopped being current. The whole of modern finance, he came to believe, had it exactly backwards. It treated the false treasures as real and the real treasures as decoration. And so he set out to write down, as plainly as he could, where the line had been crossed, not as a scold, but as a man near the end of a long career, trying to say something true before the evening came. He would begin with the thing the industry understood best: money and how quietly it disappears. Start with a rule Bogle called the relentless rules of humble arithmetic. Investing looks like a place where value gets created out of thin air. But step back, he said, and the illusion breaks. As a group, investors own the entire market. So as a group, they cannot possibly beat it. They must earn exactly what all the businesses earn, minus whatever it costs to play. And the cost of playing had grown monstrous. Finance, Bogle wrote, does not so much add value to society as subtract it, quietly moving money from the people who own the companies to the people who handle the paperwork. His fellow investor Charlie Munger put it even more harshly. Most money-making activity, Munger said, contains profoundly antisocial effects. That is a devastating thing to say about your own industry. Bogle spent the next 100 pages proving that he meant it. His first exhibit was the pay. In the years around the financial crisis, Bogle watched the men who ran Wall Street's greatest firms drive them into the ground and get paid fortunes for it. The chief who steered Citigroup into billions in losses walked away with a package worth $138 million. The head of Merrill Lynch, on his way out the door, collected over $300 million. Never, Bogle wrote, borrowing a line from Churchill, has so much been paid to so many for so little. It was a system built on a rigged coin. Heads I win, tails you lose. The executives kept the winnings when times were good, and kept their fortunes when times turned catastrophic. And the losses, those flowed downhill, onto the shareholders and pension holders who had trusted them. Someone was always paying for all of it. Bogle wanted to show you exactly how much. So he ran the numbers on a single dollar. Imagine you invest $1,000 and leave it to grow for 50 years at the market's long-run rate. Left completely alone, it becomes about $184,000. That is the magic of compounding. But now subtract the ordinary costs of investing, the fees, the trading, the roughly 2% a year that vanishes so quietly you never see it go. Suddenly, your $184,000 collapses to around $74,000. Take out taxes and inflation on top of that, and what began as a fortune ends as barely $5,000 of real spending power. Nearly 80% of everything you might have earned, gone. Bogle gave it a name that reads like a curse. The wonderful magic of compounding returns, he wrote, has been overwhelmed by the powerful tyranny of compounding costs. It is the most important sentence in the book. Multiply that quiet leak across an entire nation, and the number stops feeling abstract. Bogle estimated that the financial system was skimming more than $600 billion a year off American investors, $6 trillion a decade, simply for the service of moving their money around. And here, he pointed at something almost no one notices. In every other part of your life, you get what you pay for. Pay more, get more. Finance is the one industry that runs in reverse. There, the more you pay, the less you keep, because every dollar of cost comes straight out of your return. In investing, Bogle said, you get precisely what you don't pay for. The cheaper the fund, the richer the customer. It was such a simple inversion of common sense that most people flatly refused to believe it. And that refusal was worth a fortune to everyone except them. But costs were only half of the disease. The other half was what we had started doing with the market itself. Bogle drew a hard line between two activities that look identical and are in fact opposites. Investment means owning a piece of a business and patiently collecting what that business earns over the years. Speculation means betting on what the next person will pay for a slip of paper tomorrow. One is enterprise. The other, in the economist Keynes's phrase, is a casino. Warren Buffett had said it cleanly. The most that all owners can earn between now and Judgment Day is exactly what their businesses actually earn. Everything else is just paper changing hands. And yet the whole culture of finance had tilted toward the casino, toward the thrill of the guess. A casino, Bogle warned, always favors the house. The longer you sit at the table, the more certain you are to lose. The proof was in how fast we now traded in 1951. When Bogle first entered the business, investors held the average stock for around 6 years. By the time he sat down to write this book, the market churned so violently that shares changed hands more than twice a year. Trillions of dollars in side bets, in derivatives, were being wagered on the market, bets that dwarfed the actual companies underneath them. All that frantic motion felt like sophistication. But every trade carried a cost, and every cost was subtracted from somebody's return. As a group, Bogle showed, the traders could only lose to the patient owners because the traders were paying tolls the owners simply never incurred. It was, he said, a loser's game. Not because you might lose, but because the arithmetic guaranteed that, taken together, you would. The house always wins, and in this casino, the house was the cost. And then there was the risk you could never see coming. Bogle rode in the long shadow of the 2008 crash, and he reminded readers of Black Monday in 1987, when the market shed nearly a quarter of its value in a single day. In the world of speculation, he said, the improbable is actually highly probable. These supposedly once-in-a-lifetime shocks arrive again and again. But here he made a crucial turn. In the frenzy of daily prices, these black swans are everywhere. In the quiet reality of business, of real companies earning profits and paying dividends year after year, they are almost entirely absent. The panic lives in the trading, not in the owning, which meant the safest thing an ordinary person could possibly do was also the least exciting. Stop reacting to the storm on the surface. Own the ocean underneath it, and simply wait. Bogle's hero, then, was never the hare. It was the tortoise. The clever timer who leaps in and out looks brilliant in a good year and can be ruined in a bad one. And to time the market correctly, over and over, Bogle calculated, was roughly a 1 in 4,000 shot. The tortoise just holds on. Bogle was so certain of this that he pointed to a very public wager Warren Buffett had just laid down. $320,000, betting that a plain, cheap index fund, bought once and left completely alone, would beat a hand-picked lineup of elite hedge funds over the next 10 years. That, Bogle said, is a bet he would gladly make himself. Genius, he was convinced, is no match for low costs and patience. But finance had a weapon against patience. It was called complexity, and it was designed to make the simple truth impossible to see. There is an old principle called Occam's razor. When you are faced with competing explanations, the simplest one is usually right. Bogle argued that finance runs on the exact reverse. The industry profits by making things complicated because complexity is expensive, and expense is its living. He had watched Wall Street take ordinary home loans, slice them apart, restack the pieces, and sell them back as dazzling new instruments blessed with the highest possible ratings, a kind of financial alchemy. But you cannot turn lead into gold, he said. Dress it up however you like. Lead is still lead. When the housing market finally cracked, all that brilliant complexity turned back into exactly what it had always been. One famous banker admitted that as long as the music was playing, you simply had to keep dancing. Bogle's whole point was that someone should have switched off the music years before. The same appetite for complexity had invaded his own world, the mutual funds. When Bogle started out, the idea was simple. Buy good companies. Hold them. Keep costs low. By the end of his career, the industry had invented a dizzying parade of new products, each promising an edge, each carrying a fee. Wall Street's oldest instinct, he said, is to shout at you, don't just stand there, do something, because your activity is how they get paid. Bogle's advice was the exact opposite, and it is quietly the hardest advice in all of investing to actually follow. Don't do something, just stand there. The evidence was brutal. Over 25 years, the average fund earned about 10% a year, but the average investor in those funds earned only around 7% because they kept jumping, chasing, reacting. Their own restlessness was robbing them blind, which carried Bogle right back to the idea they had once mocked. If most of what finance sells is really cost dressed up as value, then the winning move is almost embarrassingly plain. Buy the whole market, hold it forever, and pay as close to nothing as you can. Study after study backed him. One respected Yale investment chief concluded that somewhere between 78 and 95% of professional fund managers failed to beat a simple index over the long run. Of the thousands of funds that had existed when Bogle wrote, more than half were already dead. 7 in 10 Americans said they simply did not trust the industry at all. The low-cost index fund, he argued, was never a clever trick. It was the honest default that the whole system had been built to distract you from. That was money. But Bogle was only getting started because the same sickness had spread from the balance sheet into the boardroom. On the wall of Einstein's office, Bogle liked to note, there hung a small sign. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. That single sentence became the heart of his whole argument about business. We had, he said, put numeracy in the saddle. We had fallen in love with the things we could measure, quarterly earnings, share prices, growth rates, and quietly decided that whatever we could not put a number on did not really matter. Trust, character, the long-term health of an institution. But numbers, Bogle warned, are only a pale reflection of reality, and a reflection can lie. When you manage only what you can count, you slowly stop caring about everything that actually makes a company worth having in the first place. And once that happens, he showed, people begin to bend the numbers themselves. Because when a number becomes the only thing that matters, the temptation is not to earn it, but to manufacture it. Bogle laid out just how deep the habit ran, how governments massaged their own official statistics, how companies quietly redefined what even counted as profit, until reported earnings, operating earnings, and pro forma earnings all told completely different stories. In a single stretch of years, the number of companies forced to restate their books climbed from around 90 to well over 1,500. This was not a handful of bad actors. It was a whole culture that had learned to treat the scoreboard as the game. And the social scientist Daniel Yankelovich had already mapped where that road ends. First, you measure what is easy. Then you ignore what you cannot measure. Then, finally, you decide it does not exist. That last step, Yankelovich said, is suicide. Bogle thought an entire industry was walking it. He gave the disease a clear shape. There are companies that make things, that build a product, serve a customer, create something genuinely real. And there are companies that mostly count things, that trade, that engineer deals, that move value around without ever making any. And within Bogle's own lifetime, the counters had begun to devour the makers. He watched one solid, ordinary business get bought and sold nearly 24 times, each transaction generating rich fees for the deal makers and precisely nothing for the thing itself. In these deals, he said, paper covers rock. The clever financial paper swallows the sturdy real company underneath it. Every merger looked like progress on a spreadsheet, but something was being quietly hollowed out that no spreadsheet ever recorded. The patient, unglamorous work of actually building. And you cannot run a civilization, Bogle warned, on counting alone. So the thing being lost had a name, and it was the oldest currency in all of commerce: trust. Bogle told the story of the Vanguard he had tried to build, a firm where, he insisted, market share must be a measure, never an objective. You did not chase growth for its own sake. You earned trust, and growth either followed or it didn't. He reached all the way back to Lord Nelson, the admiral who won fierce loyalty not by counting his sailors, but by trusting them so completely that they became trustworthy. That, Bogle said, is the whole secret modern finance had forgotten. Trust is not soft. It is the very thing that makes the numbers possible in the first place. And the moment you treat people as figures to be managed rather than human beings to be trusted, they hand you back exactly the loyalty you gave them, which is none. That word, profession, mattered enormously to Bogle. A profession, in the old sense, exists to serve the client first and itself second. The doctor, the lawyer, the auditor, the trustee, all bound by a duty that sits above the fee. A business, by contrast, exists to make money. And one by one, Bogle watched the great professions quietly harden into businesses. Medicine, law, accounting, journalism, each began serving the transaction instead of the person. He borrowed a sharp image for it. When the man holding the tool becomes a hammer, he starts to see every customer as a nail. Finance, he thought, had gone furthest of all, until the people who were supposed to be your trusted stewards had become, mostly, salesman. And Bogle believed you could trace that entire shift back to one quiet change, a change in who actually owned the country's companies. Here is that change, and it is quieter than any crash. Once, Americans owned their companies directly. Real people, holding real shares, watching their own money like hawks. Bogle showed how that flipped. Direct ownership collapsed from over 90% to about a quarter, while giant institutions, funds, and managers and middlemen came to control 3/4 of the entire market. We had moved, he said, from an owner's capitalism to a manager's capitalism. And Adam Smith had predicted the exact danger 2 centuries earlier. Managers of other people's money, Smith wrote, will never watch over it with the same anxious vigilance they would give their own. Negligence and waste always creep in. The people minding the store no longer own the store. And when nobody truly owns something, Bogle warned, everybody feels quietly free to help themselves, starting right at the very top. Nowhere was the helping yourself more naked than in the corner office. In 1980, the typical American chief executive earned about 42 times what the average worker did. By the peak of Bogle's era, that gap had exploded past 500 to 1. Pay was supposedly tied to performance, but the machinery, Bogle showed, was rigged so that it could only ratchet upward. Every board hired consultants to confirm that its own CEO was paid above average, which mathematically shoved every average hire forever. Buffett had a name for the typical firm running those numbers: ratchet, and bingo. And when the insiders loot the very system that made them rich, Bogle reached for a grim warning. Only capitalists can kill capitalism. The real threat to the free market, he argued, was never the outsider. It was the well-paid man on the inside who had forgotten the word enough. Then Bogle did something genuinely rare for a critic. He turned the blade on his own industry, the one he had helped to create. When he began, mutual funds held about $2 billion and were run mostly as a careful stewardship. By the time he wrote, they held $12 trillion, and the culture had curdled. Firms once owned by their own partners were swallowed whole by financial conglomerates hungry for profit. Costs kept rising even as the funds grew enormous, and the guiding question had shifted from what should we build for the investor to a single cynical line Bogle heard again and again: if you will buy it, we will make it. The industry had stopped asking what was right and started asking only what would sell. Bogle refused to pretend he was innocent of the world he came from, but he also flatly refused to stop trying to fix it. So he wrote down his dreams for what finance could still become: plain dreams, almost naive in their simple decency. Give investors a fair shake on costs. Serve them for a lifetime, not a single quarter. Think in decades, not in days. Build funds for people who actually want to own businesses, and hand real control back to the shareholders who own the funds. It all came down to one word set against another: stewardship against salesmanship. A salesman asks what he can sell you today. A steward asks what he owes you over a lifetime. Bogle wanted a financial world built by, of, and for the very people whose money it was. He knew perfectly well it sounded quaint, but he had already proved with Vanguard itself that a firm run on stewardship could not only survive, it could beat the salesmen at their own game. And doing that required a very different kind of person at the top. Bogle drew a distinction he had learned from the scholar Warren Bennis. The manager does things right. The leader does the right thing. Anyone can optimize a spreadsheet. A leader decides which spreadsheet is even worth keeping. Bogle's own rules for building something that lasts had almost nothing to do with strategy. Care, genuinely care, about the people whom he refused to call employees and insisted on calling crew members. Set high standards and then live by them. Give loyalty if you ever want loyalty back. Don't manage for the next quarter, build for the next generation. His favorite motto came from a battered old lobster boat named Press On. Nothing in the world, it read, can take the place of persistence. Because most great companies, he knew, eventually die. The only real question was whether they had deserved to live. And then, in the final third of the book, Bogle set the ledgers down entirely and turned to the thing all of it was supposedly for: a life. He opened with a scene from a novel, a courtroom, where a ruined man asks a question that haunts the whole section. Where are the things by which one measures one's life? The ancient Greeks, Bogle noted, had said that man is the measure of all things. Somewhere along the way, we had quietly reversed it until things had become the measure of the man, until a person's worth was simply assumed to equal the size of the pile he left behind. Whoever dies with the most toys wins. Bogle had spent an entire career watching brilliant people believe exactly that and lose everything that mattered while winning it. He wanted to offer a different scoreboard altogether. That different life, Bogle believed, begins with a single act: commitment. He loved a line attributed to Goethe that boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. And he loved even more what a Scottish climber named Murray added to it: that the moment you truly commit yourself, unforeseen help begins to arrive. Doors open that were never there before. Bogle had lived it. Being fired should by rights have destroyed him. Because he committed anyway, it built Vanguard instead. But commitment had a shadow twin he warned against: the shortcut. As a young newspaper reporter, he had once been tempted to simply guess a small detail rather than go and check it, and an editor's rule stayed with him for life. Never assume the color of the house. Go and look, commit fully, and cut no corners. That, he said, is how you earn a life you can actually stand behind. And where did all that commitment finally point? Not, in the end, at the office. Bogle wrote about a marriage that lasted more than half a century, about children and grandchildren, about a faith he described simply as trusting in something larger than yourself. And he wrote about gratitude of an almost startling kind. How, he liked to ask, did you arrange to be born in the United States of America? None of us earned the sheer accident of our birth, the safety, the opportunity. And to treat those gifts as personal achievements was, to him, a kind of blindness. A life of enough, Bogle argued, is not a life of getting. It is a life of belonging to a family, a community, a country, and of quietly paying back more than you were ever given. The people chasing only money, he thought, had the arithmetic exactly backwards. Bogle worried deeply that we were losing the very ideas that could still save us. We were drowning, he said, in information while slowly starving for wisdom. Soon, he feared, we would know everything the 18th century did not know, and nothing that it did. He was reaching back on purpose to the age of the Enlightenment, to Franklin and Smith and Paine and Jefferson, thinkers who prized reason, virtue, and duty to the common good over private appetite. The 21st century, by sharp contrast, prized the number, the brand, the immediate. Bogle was not being nostalgic for its own sake. He was pointing at a toolkit we had inherited and simply stopped using, a whole way of thinking about money and work that placed the character of the person above the size of the payout. And he had one favorite example of that older, wiser way of living. That example was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin invented constantly the lightning rod, the efficient stove, the bifocal lens. And here's the part Bogle most wanted you to sit with. Franklin refused to patent any of it. He had decided that, since he had benefited so greatly from the inventions of others, he ought to give his own away freely and gladly. This was a man who could have died one of the richest inventors in all of history and chose instead to found a fire company, a library, a hospital, to pour himself into the public good. To Bogle, Franklin was the very prototype of what an entrepreneur was supposed to be, not a person who extracts the most value out of society, but one who creates the most for it. Somewhere between Franklin's century and our own, we had quietly swapped that definition. Bogle wanted it back. Even Adam Smith, the patron saint of the free market, had been only half remembered. Everyone quotes his invisible hand, the idea that private self-interest can somehow serve the public good. But Bogle pointed to the Smith almost nobody quotes, the man who wrote of an impartial spectator, a kind of conscience seated within the breast, whose whole job is to remind us of the real littleness of ourselves. Self-interest, Smith knew, only works when it is governed by that inner judge. Franklin had kept a famous list of 13 virtues and asked himself each morning, "What good shall I do this day?" These were not decorations on top of a successful life. To Bogle, they were the operating system underneath it, and we had let that system quietly corrupt, which raised the sharpest question in the entire book. What exactly had we been chasing instead? Bogle answered with a story about a greyhound. A man notices a racing dog, once a champion, now retired and lying quietly in a yard, and asks whether he stopped running because he had grown too old. "No," the greyhound says. "I quit because after all that running and running and running, I finally found out that the rabbit I was chasing wasn't even real." That, Bogle said, was the confession of half the ambitious people he had ever known. They ran their whole lives at full speed, after money, after status, after the next rung on the ladder, and only at the very end discovered that the rabbit was mechanical, a lure that could never be caught and was never once worth catching. The tragedy he saw was not losing the race. The tragedy was winning it and looking down and finally seeing what you had actually been chasing. So Bogle put the usual prizes on trial. "Wealth," he said, "is the shallowest measure of a life. It counts only what you took, never what you gave. Fame is mostly noise. Power is worth having only in the service of a worthy purpose and worthless otherwise." And he named a special danger for anyone who works with money. Descartes had warned that a man is nearly incapable of understanding any argument that threatens his own income, meaning the better finance pays you, the harder it becomes to see clearly what finance is actually doing. Bogle felt that pull his entire life and fought it. The truest measures, he insisted, are the ones that never appear on any statement. Whether you did honest work, whether you helped, whether the people who depended on you were genuinely better for it. Everything else is just counting the toys again. And beneath all of it, Bogle placed one foundation, and he was blunt that nothing else survives without it. Character. Not talent, not intelligence, not even hard work. Character. The willingness to do the right thing when the wrong thing pays better and no one at all is watching. He reached for the oldest advice there is, from Shakespeare. "To thine own self be true." A career built on skill alone, he had seen too often, can collapse in a single dishonest choice. But a life built on character holds. And here, Bogle turned his own thesis clean on its head. "There is one thing," he said, "of which you can never have too much. One place where the whole logic of enough runs the other way. You can have too much money, too much fame, too much power. You can never ever have enough character." Which is when Bogle finally turned the question on himself. What for him was enough? His answer was almost scandalous for a man who had built a company worth trillions. He gave away roughly half of everything he earned, every single year, funding scholarships for hundreds of students at the very schools that had once carried him. By the ordinary scoreboard, he cheerfully called himself a financial failure, and meant it as a boast. Because Vanguard had been built to enrich its customers instead of its founder, he had personally handed more than $100 billion back to ordinary investors that another man would have simply kept. And Bogle knew, better than almost anyone, how little of it he could take with him. He was riding with a transplanted heart, given by an anonymous stranger after his own had failed. "A beating heart," he said, "beats a diamond every time." And then he handed the question to you. When John D. Rockefeller, the richest man of his entire age, was asked how much money was finally enough, he famously answered, "Just a little bit more." That, Bogle said, is the whole trap, in 4 words. Because a little bit more has no end to it, ever. His own definition was funnier and far more freeing. "Enough," he wrote, "is $1 more than you need." The work, then, is not to earn without limit. It is to figure out, honestly, what your number actually is, in money, in things, in ambition, and then to stop, and to spend the rest of your one life on what simply cannot be bought. Bogle believed a whole country had lost track of that line, and he suspected that whether America ever found it again would decide far more than any market ever could. Which brings us right back to that party on Shelter Island and the 7 words that started everything. After Joe Heller died, Kurt Vonnegut wrote a small poem about that night, that the billionaire host, for all his money, would always lack the one thing Heller owned, the knowledge that he had got enough. Bogle closed his own book, not with a market forecast, but with a line of Tennyson, the old sailor Ulysses, refusing to coast quietly to the end, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. He had been given enough, he said, and never, ever enough to be self-satisfied. So here's the question he leaves with you, the one the whole industry is quietly built to keep you from asking. In your money, your work, your life, do you know what your enough is? And when you reach it, Will you have the courage to say so?